The Su-8 is a new Battle Pass reward in War Thunder. Let's check it out. Back during World War II, the Soviet Union made extensive use of close air support aircraft and were prolific users of planes like the IL-2, Su-6, and P-39 for low-level attack missions in support of troops on the ground. The Su-8 was the result of an attempt to develop a longer-range aircraft dedicated to this kind of low-altitude ground attack mission that could take off from air bases safe behind the front lines. The plane was developed under wartime conditions, and both its design and production were a bit rushed. Eventually, though, the prototypes were completed in mid-1943, but the aircraft didn't fly until early the next year due to logistical difficulties, with the war being on. Well, during initial testing, the Su-8 was found to have sufficient firepower, good weapons capacity, armor, and range, but by the time a few refinements were made to the design and it was considered ready for production, wartime priorities had changed a bit. The Red Army was advancing fast enough that captured German airfields could be used, and the need for a longer-range attack aircraft was a bit less urgent. Additionally, Stalin was completely obsessed with the IL-2, stating once in a memo that production of the IL-2 was as vital to the army as air to breathe and bread to eat. That's a direct quote. Well, after an industrial analysis, it was found that for the raw materials and production labor that would be needed to build an Su-8, that almost 2.5 IL-2s could be produced. And given the increased range of the Su-8 no longer being a big priority, this was quite a heavy blow to the program. Once that report reached the upper echelons of the Soviet hierarchy, the fate of the Su-8 was sealed and the project was abandoned, with only the initial set of prototypes having been produced. In War Thunder, the plane is a reward from the early 2022 Firepower Battle Pass season. It's classified as a strike aircraft in the game and sits at rank 4 at battle rating 4.7. The very first thing to say about this plane is that its firepower is absolutely inappropriate. It has 4 45mm cannons and 8 Schuss machine guns for a total burst mass of almost 20 kilograms. Anything in the air that you can get a solid second or two of time on target is simply erased from existence, and the cannons can remove AI ground targets and even some medium tanks and ground RB if you get good angles on your shots. Oh, and it has 2 gun turrets, one on the top with a relatively good field of fire, and one angled behind and below the tail. The big catch, though, is that the Su-8 doesn't get a bomb sight view, which kinda sucks for a plane like this. The Su-8 counts as a premium aircraft, so you get all of its weapons right from the start, and it has a pretty good variety of bombs and rockets to choose from. You can go with just bombs, just rockets, or a mix of the two. I personally prefer the loadout with the 2 Fab 500 bombs and 6 RBS 132 rockets, but if you prefer the higher number of smaller weapons, you can totally do that too. Now, the flight performance of the Su-8 isn't wonderful. It kind of feels like flying a B-25 medium bomber. It's lumbery and a bit unstable in rolls, and its vertical pull coming out of a high-speed dive can be surprisingly stiff. This is a case where you're definitely going to want to, if you get this out of the Battle Pass, you're going to want to practice some dive bombing and test flights before you take it out into missions. Now, the climb performance is also a little bit below average, remembering that this is a big, heavy aircraft, and the acceleration isn't really great either. The silver lining is that the Su-8 is a pretty tough plane, and it's difficult to shoot down. I was quite surprised a few times by the amount of punishment this thing can take. When you fly the Su-8 out into missions, Try to think of it as flying a light bomber instead of a more conventional strike aircraft. The flight performance, and especially the maneuverability, isn't going to give you great performance for sustained air combat, and if you think of it like you're flying a bomber, you'll be let down less often. Since it's a strike aircraft, though, you'll get the air spawn in realistic battles, which will usually give you a chance to attack something before getting intercepted. If you can manage to get this thing pointed at enemy planes, they're back to hangar almost as soon as you pull the trigger. The forward-facing firepower on this aircraft is just totally absurd, and while the plane is still new, you might be able to get some good kills from catching people off guard. The bad news is, the plane is just awful in dogfights, and if you find yourself in a close turning engagement, it probably isn't going to last long unless your gun turret gets lucky with a pilot snipe or something. If you focus on ground attack, and you can manage to stay isolated, the combination of generous ammo for its guns and an adequate load of external weapons can really let you rack up some decent number of kills on AI targets. This might end up being a pretty popular low-tier grinder for people. Now it's worth mentioning, as usual with mid to low-tier props like this, that in arcade mode, everything is a bit more sloppy and forgiving. I was able to hand out some pretty severe punishment in arcade battles with the Su-8 by using its great armor and survivability combined with the insane forward firepower. Even a long-distance deflection shot can be enough to take things down. Now, an area where I think the Su-8 is going to really shine for people is close air support. Flying this plane out in ground RB, I had a lot of luck flying it like a jet fighter, making longer, lower passes through the battlefield instead of loitering around directly above it. Despite how tough the thing is, sustained hits from AAA will eventually cause you problems, and since the plane isn't super stable, you might need to carefully line up your shots a bit more deliberately than you'd be able to if you're like coming out of a tight maneuver or something. Now visually, I kinda like this one. I'm digging the unusual nose design, and I've always kind of liked the, twin-engine prop aircraft like this. The default paint job isn't really too exciting, but it's still a good-looking plane. Landing the Su-8, practice it once or twice first. The landing flaps generate an absolutely enormous amount of lift, and nowhere near enough drag. So if you do conventional landings with this one, you might find yourself running into some really severe pitch up on approach. It's a tail dragger, so you're going to want to take care when braking after you touch down, so just practice the landing a couple times. Now the cockpit of the Su-8, well, it's just a placeholder, and it looks pretty awful. It is exciting to fire off all those guns from inside the cockpit view, but the visibility is horrible. Though you do get some glass floor to help with bombing runs, but you still don't get the bomb sight view. Overall, it's kind of a crappy cockpit. To close out on the Sukhoi Su-8, this plane has a totally absurd amount of firepower coming out of its front end, and it has a pretty good selection of loadouts for additional weapons. Plus, it's well armored, and it can take a good amount of damage before going down. However, it lumbers a bit in the air, and it's not maneuverable at all. It doesn't get a bomb sight view, and its climb performance isn't really that good for an attacker. The final verdict on the Su-8 is that this plane has the potential to be a beast for close air support, and could even be a makeshift bomber interceptor. Overall, it's not a bad prize for the Battle Pass. As always, thanks for watching.